Angel's blessing to you, and welcome to the channel Angel's message for you. If this message has found its way to your screen today, please know that it is not by accident, and it is certainly not a coincidence. The universe has perfectly guided you here because there is something you deeply need to hear. Have you been feeling a sudden, unexplainable shift in the air lately? Like something huge is right around the corner, but your mind just cannot quite picture it yet? Maybe you have been waking up in the middle of the night for no reason, having very vivid dreams that feel completely real, or getting sudden warm chills down your arms while you are just doing normal things like driving down the highway or walking through the grocery store. Maybe you have just had this strong gut feeling that a certain someone is thinking about you right at this very second, and the feeling is so strong that it actually makes your heart beat a little bit faster. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, grab a warm drink, and please watch this video until the very end, because the universe is about to validate exactly what your heart has been trying to tell you all along. A massive, beautiful change is knocking on your door, and the message you are about to hear holds the exact answers you have been praying for. What you are about to learn today will change the way you look at your past, your present, and the beautiful future that is currently unfolding just for you. Dear one, today I am here to wrap you in a warm spiritual hug and confirm what your beautiful soul has already sensed deep down in your bones. Brand new chapter has officially arrived in your life, and this new chapter brings with it a goodbye. Now, please take a deep breath and do not be alarmed by that word. I know the word goodbye usually brings up feelings of sadness, loss, and heartbreak, but this goodbye is completely different. This goodbye is not about losing your soulmate. It is not about an ending between the two of you. In fact, it is the exact opposite of that. Your person is currently saying the hardest, most necessary goodbye to everything that ever stood in the way of your beautiful connection. They are saying goodbye to the physical distance, to their endless excuses, and to the deep fears they carried inside for so long. They are saying goodbye to the fear of not being good enough for you, to the fear of commitment, and to the emotional walls they built to hide their true feelings from the world. They are officially done hiding behind silence and pretending that everything is perfectly fine when they are actually hurting inside. They are walking away from the days of loving you only in their private thoughts and never showing up for you in real life. Your love is finally stepping up, not because it is an easy thing for them to do, but because it has simply become impossible for them to keep living like this. They have learned the hard way that real, true love cannot survive in a space made only of missing someone. Love needs to breathe. It needs eye contact. It needs to be lived out, loud in the open every single day. I know there have been days when you questioned absolutely everything about this connection. You might have wondered how many times you could wake up with a tight chest, feeling their energy right there in the room with you, even when they were miles and miles away in another city or even another state. You have caught yourself thinking about them right in the middle of a busy workday, wondering why someone you tried so hard to move on from is still taking up so much space in your mind and in your heart. You might have even felt a little bit crazy, sitting on your couch wondering if you were just making it all up because you wanted it so badly. I am here to tell you with complete certainty that it was never just your imagination playing tricks on you. That is your deep soul level connection trying to survive through all the heavy barriers of time, logic, and physical distance. What connects two souls simply cannot be explained by regular everyday rules. It does not make sense to the logical mind, but it is felt so deeply in the spirit, and yes, sometimes that deep feeling can really hurt. It is a heavy weight to carry when you love someone so much, but you cannot just reach out and hold their hand. I know you have spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, tossing and turning, wondering if this story ever had a real future or if it was all just a hopeful dream playing on a loop in your head. You probably talked to your friends about it until you felt like you could not bring it up anymore, keeping the secret locked away inside your chest. Today, I come as a messenger from heaven to bring you the ultimate truth. It was never just in your head. Your person felt it too. They felt every single ounce of the love you sent their way, even when you did not say a word. They felt it, but they just did not know how to handle it. They loved you so deeply, but they did not know how to reach you without feeling totally exposed and terrified. They wanted nothing more than to be close to you, to share their life with you, to tell you about their day. But they lacked the strength to break free from their own inner demons and insecurities. They were tied down by past hurts, childhood baggage, and the false belief that true love always ends up ending in disaster. They looked at the beautiful thing the two of you had, and instead of seeing a blessing, they saw a risk, and so they chose to run. But something inside them has finally shifted in the most massive way. A huge change is happening within their spirit right now. A truth woke up inside their heart that could not be pushed down, ignored, or delayed for one more second. Feeling rose up that yelled much louder than their pride, much louder than their doubts, and way louder than their worst fears. And that feeling gave way to a silent but incredibly powerful decision to finally leave behind everything that has kept them away from you. This goodbye that is happening in their life right now is actually a beautiful release. It is the birth of a brand new courage that this person never had before in their entire life. You might not be able to see it with your own physical eyes just yet, but there is a massive, invisible energy shift happening in the spiritual background of your life. An old, painful cycle is coming to an absolute end, and with it, a brave, new, and honest version of your love is being born. A version of them that chooses to stop running away when things get real. A version that stops pretending they do not care. A version that refuses to live a halfway life anymore, settling for less than what their heart truly desires. This kind of deep soul transformation does not happen overnight. It takes time to break down heavy brick walls that have been up for years and years. But the good news is that the process has already started, and it cannot be stopped. And you, even without fully realizing it, are already being prepared for what is coming. The universe has been gently getting your heart ready to welcome this person back into your daily life. Lately, you might have felt way more sensitive than usual. Maybe you have wanted to stay indoors, be alone in your own cozy space, overthink past choices, or search for deep answers to questions you thought you buried a long time ago. You might find yourself crying over a commercial on television or feeling deep empathy for a stranger on the street. All of these feelings are a normal part of the spiritual process. Heaven has been trying to prepare your energy field for something your logical mind cannot yet understand. You are being cracked open so that more light can enter your life. It is like you are missing them intensely before they even make a physical move toward you. Your heart is anticipating a major shift that the physical world has not quite caught up with yet. You might hear a song on the radio while you are driving that tells your exact story word for word, and it gives you goosebumps all over your arms. You might see their name pop up randomly on a billboard, street sign, or a screen for absolutely no reason at all. You might see repeating numbers everywhere you look, like 1111, 222, or 333, constantly reminding you that you are on the right path and that the angels are walking right beside you. You might just get this sudden, warm feeling of peace washing over you when nobody else is around, like someone has just wrapped a warm blanket over your shoulders. These are powerful little signs from the angels that the ice is finally melting between the two of you, even when life tried so hard to pull you apart, throwing every possible obstacle in your way. Your bond only grew stronger. I know this long journey has brought you to tears more times than you can count. I know you carried so many doubts and cried silently when nobody was watching, wiping away your tears before anyone could ask you what was wrong. You fought daily internal battles, trying to convince yourself to let go, move on, and just forget about them. You probably tried to date other people, tried to bury yourself in your work, and tried to pretend that you were completely over it. But still, a little piece of hope inside you never died. It flickered like a tiny candle in the dark, refusing to be blown out. That thread of hope is incredibly sacred. It holds the memory of every beautiful moment you ever shared with them, every laugh, every deep conversation, and it connects you directly to the beautiful future that is on its way right now. Love that is this real defies time, it defies fear, and it survives even the worst mistakes human beings can make. Your person is a part of that unbreakable bond. And deep down, no matter what happened on the surface, your soul has always known it. For a very long time, your person fought a bitter, exhausting war against themselves. They tried so hard to be logical, practical, and realistic. They told themselves over and over again that it just wasn't the right time, or that it wasn't safe to fall so hard for someone, or that they had too much going on in their own life to focus on a real relationship. From the very beginning, they knew this feeling was totally different from anything they had ever experienced. It did not follow the normal rules of modern dating. It defied everything they thought they knew about love and romance. And to be completely honest with you, that terrified them to their core. It was like their heart desperately wanted to run toward you, to claim you, to be with you, but their mind was screaming at them to stay away, stay safe, and stay closed off in their little bubble of protection. So they began to resist. They did not pull away out of malice or because they wanted to hurt you on purpose. They pulled away purely out of fear and self-preservation. There were countless times they tried to convince themselves that walking away was the best thing for both of you, that they were somehow doing you a favor by leaving you alone because they felt they were too broken to love you properly. They tried to distract themselves in every possible way. They filled their schedule with extra hours at work, threw themselves into random hobbies, and stuck to rigid daily routines just to numb the deep, swirling emotions they were feeling inside. They hid behind silly excuses that seemed easier to accept than the scary truth. But deep inside, the feeling simply would not go away, no matter how many days, weeks, or months passed by without talking. To you, the pull toward your soul always came back. And every single time it came back so much stronger, knocking the wind right out of them. You might have sat up at night and wondered why they ran away right when things were getting so good, right when things were feeling so incredibly real and magical. The simple answer is that loving you was incredibly intense for them. It shone a bright spotlight on all their old, unhealed wounds. It brought up every single insecurity they ever had about themselves. It reminded them of past losses, betrayals, and heartbreaks they had tried to pretend never happened. So, out of sheer panic, they built a massive, thick brick wall around their heart. But slowly, over time, that wall became far too heavy for them to carry. They spent so much energy trying not to text you, trying not to call you, and trying not to look at your social media pages that they ended up completely exhausting their own soul. They were fighting a losing battle against the universe itself. There were mornings they woke up swearing to themselves that today would be the day they finally forgot about you and moved on with their life. But by the time the sun went down and the house got quiet, they were totally overwhelmed by memories of your beautiful smile, the sound of your laugh, and the deep, meaningful conversations you used to share. They would close their eyes at night to sleep, only to find you waiting for them in their dreams, holding their hand, and looking at them with nothing but pure love. The inner pressure of living, this lie slowly started to break them down. They discovered that staying in their safe, comfortable, predictable zone did not actually feel safe at all. Just felt cold, boring, and terribly lonely. They realized that a life without you in it was a life that lacked real color and real joy. There came a breaking point where resisting just didn't make any sense anymore. Swimming against the powerful current of true love only made them drown in their own sadness and regret. The emotional exhaustion finally took its toll on them. Physically and mentally, their body felt heavy, their mind felt foggy, their soul demanded that they finally sit down and pay attention to the truth. And that is when they finally realized they could no longer hide from their own destiny. You may not have seen this with your own eyes, and they may be too proud to ever admit it to you out loud, but your person cried over you. They cried heavy, real tears. They cried in the privacy of their own car parked in the driveway. They cried in the shower where nobody could hear them. They cried in moments of total silence, hiding the pain they pretended to the rest of the world that they did not have. They tried to take steps forward without you, trying to build a normal life, but every step felt like carrying 100 pounds of weight on their back. They realized with a sudden sharp pain in their chest that the absolute worst pain in the world wasn't losing you. It was the fact that they didn't even try hard enough to keep you when they had the chance. And now, after so much stubborn resistance, they are fully surrendering to the divine plan. This is not a surrender of weakness or giving up. It is a massive, beautiful surrender of ultimate courage. It is the courage to admit that love has finally won the battle. It is the courage to admit that you have won their heart completely and utterly. They are currently having a quiet, internal farewell to the old, scared version of themselves. They are saying goodbye to the version of them that always chose fear over love, logic over passion, and distance over intimacy. They are leaving behind the person who was so heavily guarded that they became a lonely prisoner inside their own mind. The hardest part of this beautiful transformation is that it is totally invisible to the outside world. To their friends, their coworkers, and their family members, they might look exactly the same as they always have. but inside their chest, a total, glorious revolution is taking place. They are looking back at their entire life with more brutal, raw honesty than ever before. They are mourning the precious time they wasted acting like they did not care. They are mourning the beautiful chances they missed to hold your hand in public, to tell you how amazing you are, and to build a solid life by your side. This is a silent, heartfelt apology that is being sent directly from their soul to your soul, even if the physical words have not reached your ears just yet. They are tired of sweeping their deep feelings under the rug. They are so incredibly tired of living a divided life, smiling on the outside while their heart aches on the inside. Now, their spirit is begging for truth and begging for freedom. They are slowly and carefully building a solid bridge straight back to your heart, laying down one brick of courage at a time. Please understand that this shift is entirely real. It is not a fairy tale or wishful thinking. You might not see the solid proof on the outside today, but the wheels are already turning in the spiritual realm. When someone finally decides to break out of their own emotional prison, they do not ever want to go back inside. Your love is shedding their heavy armor. They are looking in the mirror and facing their old childhood traumas. They are challenging the negative, toxic beliefs that told them they weren't worthy of a pure, amazing, unconditional love like yours. They are tearing down the wall brick by heavy brick, and it is scary for them, truly scary. They are losing their familiar pride and their false sense of control over their emotions. But they know, without a shadow of a doubt, that they have to empty themselves of all the bad stuff so they can make room for the beautiful, peaceful future they want to build with you. When their heart finally reached its absolute limit of pain and longing, they did something they rarely ever do. In a quiet, private moment of total desperation, they looked up to the sky and asked heaven for real help. They didn't pray using perfect, fancy words. They just spoke from a raw, tired, aching heart. They asked the universe to give them the physical and mental strength to go back to the person they love so much. They asked for help to let go of their stubbornness and their fear of rejection. They asked the angels to show them the clearest way back to you. This was not just a passing thought. It was a deep, vulnerable plea for divine guidance. They finally admitted that they could not fix this huge emotional mess all by themselves. They realized that no matter which direction they tried to run, no matter what new city they visited, or what new job they took, their internal compass always pointed straight back to you. You are their true north. And when a human soul asks for help with that kind of pure, raw honesty, heaven moves actual mountains to answer them. The angels heard their cry for help, and the universe immediately started shifting circumstances in your favor. This is why you have been feeling that strange, comforting energy lately, almost as if someone is hugging your spirit. This is why a sudden wave of tenderness washes over you when you picture their face, replacing the anger or frustration you might have felt before. It is the universe working backstage, opening the heavy doors that were slammed shut and untangling all the messy emotional knots that kept you apart for so long. Your person is learning that true vulnerability is not a weakness at all. It is the most beautiful, powerful strength a human being can possibly possess. This courage they are finding within themselves is quiet, but it is incredibly solid. It is the kind of courage that makes them want to look you directly in the eye instead of looking down at the floor. It is the courage to reach out and send that message, even if their hands are shaking while they type it. They are starting to make entirely different choices in their daily life, choices that align with love instead of fear. You might notice very soon that their energy feels much softer, much more open, and a lot less defensive than it used to be. This is them coming out of their dark emotional cocoon and turning into something beautiful. It is not an easy process for them, and growing pains are real, but their intention is absolutely pure. They want to make you smile. They want to give you the whole, healthy, healed version of themselves that you always deserved from the very beginning. But my dear friend, before all of this beautiful, sweeping change shows up in your physical reality, there is some very important work that needs to be done within your own beautiful heart. I am telling you all of this today so you can start preparing yourself right now, getting your energy right. When they come back into your life, they are not going to be a flawless, perfect angel. They are still a human being. They will come to you carrying the fresh scars of their inner battle. They might be a little bit shy at first. They might hesitate or struggle to find the exact right words to say to explain where they have been and what they have been going through. Please do not mistake their nervousness or their quietness for a lack of love. They are simply terrified of messing things up with you again. They are carrying the heavy, beautiful weight of finally trying to do things right, and the pressure they put on themselves is immense. This is exactly where your spiritual maturity and your beautiful, loving heart come in. You must be ready to receive them with pure grace, deep understanding, and immense patience. It is absolutely crucial that you actively let go of any leftover bitterness, grudges, or resentment that might be hiding in the dark corners of your heart. I know you were deeply hurt in the past. I know you felt abandoned, confused, taken for granted, and maybe even a little bit foolish for loving them so much. Your pain is completely valid, and heaven has seen every single tear you ever cried over this situation. But what this person is bringing to you now is not a repeat of the ugly past. It is a totally new, completely fresh beginning. If you hold on to the anger of yesterday, if you bring up past mistakes as a weapon, you will accidentally build a brand new wall right where they just worked so hard to tear one down. You have to trust yourself. Trust that you are strong enough, wise enough, and grounded enough to love them again, without losing your own balance or your own peace of mind. You do not need to diminish your own worth, walk on eggshells, or lower your healthy boundaries, but you do need to be a safe, welcoming, warm harbor for their ship to finally dock. Show them through your actions that it is totally safe to be honest with you, even when the truth is a little bit messy. Show them that love can be a peaceful sanctuary, not just a chaotic battlefield. The long time you spent waiting, crying, and healing was not a waste of your precious life. It was a divine training camp for your beautiful soul. During that time apart, you learned how to be fiercely independent. You learned how to find your own joy without needing someone else to provide it for you. You learned how to trust the universe and lean on your faith even when everything in your physical reality looked totally hopeless. You are so much stronger, wiser, and more beautiful now than you were when this whole journey started. You are ready for a mature, lasting love. This upcoming reunion between the two of you is not just going back to the way things used to be. Going backward is impossible because neither of you are the exact same people you were back then. This is a brilliant creation of something completely new and wonderfully solid. This sacred encounter is happening because both of your souls have finally reached the exact level of emotional and spiritual maturity needed to make a real relationship last forever. You were both being shaped, molded, and polished by the gentle hands of the universe during your time apart. Now, the cold season of distance is coming to a beautiful, warm close. The empty space between you is shrinking every single minute of every single day. You might sit and wonder how this is all going to happen. Let me assure you, it will not be like a dramatic, highly scripted movie scene. It will likely happen in the most simple, unexpected, and completely natural way possible. It might be a gentle, simple text message asking how you have been. It might be a random, serendipitous run-in at a local coffee shop, the grocery store, or walking down the street. It might be a phone call totally out of the blue on a random Tuesday afternoon. When it happens, please do not panic. Take a deep breath. Do not immediately try to figure out where it is going, what it all means, or demand strict guarantees for the future right in that exact moment. Just breathe, smile, your beautiful smile, and stay entirely present in the moment. True, lasting love grows best in the simple, quiet, unforced moments of shared time and gentle conversation. There will absolutely be a learning curve. After being emotionally and physically apart for a while, you will both have to figure out how to walk side by side again without stepping on each other's toes. You will have to learn each other's new rhythms and new boundaries. But the biggest, most important difference this time around is the pure intention behind it. There is a mutual, burning desire to make it work this time. When two people truly want to understand each other, when they are both willing to put their egos aside, even the hardest challenges just become beautiful lessons that bring them closer. Together, you are stepping into a golden time where love gets to just breathe easily and be happy without heavy guilt, without a frantic rush, and without the paralyzing fear that it is all going to fall apart at any second. Please hear my words when I say that you have been incredibly, unbelievably brave to keep your heart open through all of the pain, the waiting, and the confusion. The universe is incredibly proud of your quiet strength and your beautiful resilience. You did not give up on love, even when it would have been so much easier to just turn cold, build a fortress around your heart, and become bitter towards the world. Because you chose to keep your inner light shining, because you chose to remain soft in a hard world, you are about to be rewarded with the kind of pure, peaceful, honest relationship that most people only ever get to dream about. The painful past has been completely washed away by the divine. All the silly misunderstandings, the painful silent treatments, the arguments, and the misconnections have been totally cleared from your energetic record. You have a completely blank canvas in front of you now, and you get to paint whatever beautiful future you want on it. Will you choose to look backward at the old sadness, replaying the old hurtful memories in your mind, or will you turn your beautiful face toward the warm sun and fully accept this amazing new blessing? I gently encourage you to choose the blessing. Trust your incredible, powerful intuition. If this deep connection were truly meant to end, if it was really over for good, it would have completely faded from your mind and your heart a very long time ago. But it stayed. It burned quietly in the background of your life like a warm, comforting candle, providing a tiny bit of light even on your darkest days. That little candle was protected by the angels themselves, so the harsh winds of the world could not blow it out. Over the next few days, weeks, and months, please stay very aware of your surroundings. Keep your eyes and your heart wide open. Pay close attention to the small, beautiful details in your daily life. The universe absolutely loves to speak to you through fun, little magical synchronicities. You might find a shiny coin on the ground right at the exact moment you are thinking about them. You might see a beautiful butterfly or a specific bird land near you when you are feeling a little bit sad or doubtful. You might hear a stranger say a very specific phrase that only you and your person used to say to each other. Smile when these magical things happen. Acknowledge them. Say thank you to the universe out loud. Staying in a positive mindset of pure gratitude is the absolute fastest way to pull this beautiful reality right into your physical life. When you are grateful for the little signs, the universe blesses you with the big miracle. You do not have to chase them. Please remember that. You do not have to force anything to happen. You do not need to manipulate the situation, send a million texts, or plan out exactly what you are going to say when you finally see them. Just focus entirely on keeping your own energy bright, calm, peaceful, and happy. Focus on treating yourself with the exact same unconditional love, patience, and kindness that you so deeply want to receive from them. Take long, quiet walks in nature, eat good nourishing food, drink plenty of water, listen to uplifting music that makes you want to dance in your living room, and just thoroughly enjoy the beautiful, peaceful life you have built for yourself. When you are totally relaxed and glowing with genuine self-love, you actually act like a giant, powerful magnet for all the good things heaven is trying to send. You become absolutely irresistible to the beautiful future that is meant for you. While you are focusing on yourself, your person is quietly getting their own life totally organized so they can finally be a real, solid partner to you. They are clearing out their own mental and emotional clutter. They are stepping away from toxic friends, draining situations, or bad habits that kept their personal vibration low for so long. They are fully aligning with their highest, truest self. And as they do this deep inner work, the invisible magnetic pull between the two of you gets stronger and stronger with every passing second. You might even feel a little dizzy, sleepy, or lightheaded out of nowhere during your day. Do not worry, that is just your physical energy field adjusting to the massive influx of pure love and high-frequency light that is heading your way. Make sure to drink plenty of water, get extra rest when your body asks for it, and trust completely that your physical body knows exactly how to handle this amazing spiritual upgrade. Remember, my dear friend, true, lasting love does not usually show up wrapped in perfect little box with a neat bow on top. It does not look exactly like the romantic movies on television. It shows up real. It shows up messy sometimes. Shows up ready to do the actual work, ready to communicate through the hard times, and ready to grow through every season of life together. Your person has finally realized after all this time that you are the exact one they want to do all that hard work for. They want to be your solid rock. They want to be the one who holds you tightly when you have a bad day at work, and they want to be the one who cheers the absolute loudest for you when you achieve your goals and win at life. They have seen what their life looks like without you in it, and they have decided with absolute certainty that they never ever want to live that way again. A life without you is just not a life they are interested in. So I am asking you to take a massive, deep, cleansing breath right now. Breathe in pure, white, peaceful light, and breathe out all the dark, heavy anxiety. Drop your shoulders down away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Relax your hands. Let go of all that heavy, exhausting waiting energy. You do not have to wait in pain anymore. The waiting room of your life is officially closed. And the door to your glorious new life is swinging wide open right in front of you. Walk through that door with total confidence, your head held high and a soft smile on your face. You are a radiant, beautiful, incredibly strong soul who is so incredibly deserving of this massive blessing. Heaven has held your hand through every single dark, lonely night, and heaven is going to walk right beside you into this bright, beautiful, sunny new dawn. Keep your daily thoughts as positive as you possibly can. When the old fear tries to sneak into your mind late at night and whisper silly lies about the past, tell it to pack its bags and leave immediately. Replace every single fearful thought with a bright, hopeful one. Tell yourself every single morning, when you look in the bathroom mirror, that you are fully worthy of a love that stays, a love that heals, and a love that protects. Tell yourself that you are totally safe, you are deeply cherished, and you are divinely guided in every single step you take. The universe responds instantly to your energetic vibration, so keep it as high, as peaceful, and as joyful as you possibly can. Everything you have ever asked for in the quiet of the night, every tear you shed, every wish you made on a shooting star, is being carefully bundled up and prepared for direct delivery into your life. The goodbye to the painful, confusing past is officially complete. The welcome to the joyful, secure, and passionate future is happening right here, right now. Smile, take a deep breath, and feel the peace wash over you, because your specific story is about to get so incredibly good. You are about to step into a period of deep, unshakable peace, profound soul-level connection, and beautiful, lasting, unconditional love. The angels are actively celebrating this massive victory with you in the spiritual realm right now. Just trust the divine timing, trust the beautiful, warm feelings inside your soul, and keep your beautiful heart completely wide open to receive the miracle. You have done the work. You have passed the tests. You are entirely ready for this. Amen.